Some work with percents that equal up to 100 or that are in between 100 and 1. And so today our focus is going to be on percents that are going to be greater than 100 or percents that are going to be less than 1. So if we take a look at our solve and share, our first problem that we're going to look at is Marcy, Bobby, and Max began their homework at the same time. Marcy finished her homework in 60 minutes. Bobby finishes homework in 50% of Marcy's time, and Max finishes homework in 150% of Marcy's time. How long did each of them work? Use the number lines to help you. So you'll notice here, Bobby's is well within that 1 to 100 range for percents, but Max's is 150, so it's above and beyond. And so when we take a look at the number line, I'm going to start with Marcy's. So I'm going to show you what this is going to look like visually. So Marcy's number line is, if we go right here, right, and say, because I have a number that's going to be greater than 100, I'm going to say right here, this is 100%. And she did that in 60 minutes. Okay. And then I'm going to take a look at Bobby's. And Bobby's is going to be 50%. So if that middle line represents my 100%, then this one is going to represent my 50%. And 50% is going to be 30 minutes. So if we take a look at Max's is going to be greater than 100. So if I look at Max's, here's my 50%, here's my 100%, here's my 150%. So 150% of 60 is going to be 90 minutes. And how I found that was I took my 60 minutes and I added that to my 30 minutes, and that gave me 90 minutes because this was 100%, this was 50%, and so if I take 100% and I take 50% and I add them together, I get 90 minutes, which was 150%. Did Max spend more or less time on his homework than Marcy? He spent more time than Marcy. He spent an additional 30 minutes more. So he spent 30 minutes more than Marcy. All right, let's move into our next problem. So if we take a look at our next problem, our big question that we're working on today says, how can you write a percent greater than 100 as a fraction and as a decimal? And it also should be, how can I write it less than 1 as a fraction and a decimal? So John and Kim built model cars for science project. Kim's cars traveled 140% as far as Jan's car. How can you write 140% as a fraction and a decimal? So we need to look at what percent is. So remember, our denominator for percent does not change. So our denominator for percent is always going to be out of 100. And so if Jan traveled 100%, hers is going to be 100 out of 100. If Kim traveled, so this represents right here 100%, which I would write it as 1 as a decimal. But Kim traveled 140%. And so my numerator, I will write that as 140%. As a decimal, what this would be, would be 140. Let me erase that, not percent. As a decimal, it would be 1 decimal 4, because 100 goes into 140 one time. It has 40 hundredths left over, or 4 tenths. Okay, so if we look at their examples that they gave us, we can write as a fraction compared to 100. That's what we did. I didn't simplify it. I should have. So it would be written as 7/5. We always need to make sure that we remember to simplify. And then here I did 140 hundredths equals 14 tenths, which equals 1/4. Or we use division. 100 goes into 140 1.4 times. Okay, right here, look at this. A decimal value greater than 1 always will be a percent greater than 100%. So if I have 1.8, that would be 180%. The fraction equivalent of a percent greater than 100 has a numerator greater than denominator. So if I had 1.8 and I had 180 over 100, that would be 180%. All right, let's move into the convince me. How would you write 1 75 hundredths as a percent? give an example of how you would use that percent as greater than 100. So it would be 1 and 75 hundredths. Again, remembering that percent means out of 100. So I would take the 1.75 and I would multiply that by 100, which means moving the decimal 2 places to the right. And then if I wrote this as a fraction, it would be 175 over 100. And then I would simplify this by dividing by 25. So it would be 4, and then it would be 7/4. Okay. When we would use this would be something like this. Kelly ran 175% more than Jess in track. That would be how I would represent or use that as an example. All right, let's move into your guided practice. So now we're looking at using a percent that is going to be less than 1. So if you take a look here, it's 1/100th. So 1/100th is going to be, we're looking at 1/1000. So if I have half of a percent, look right here, I would take a half and I would divide that by 100. So if I had taken half and I divide it by 100, it would be written as 1/200, because again, we keep change flip. So 100, the reciprocal for 100, right? It's 100 over 1. I flip it and I multiply by the reciprocal. And so it would be 1/100th times 1/2, which equals 1/200th. Okay, so half a percent would be written as 1/200ths, or as a decimal, it would be written as 0.005%, because again, I move that decimal 2 places to the left, so it needs to be 3 places out. It would be 1,000th of a percent. So we'll spend some time doing some more examples with that. Explain why 140% is greater than 1. Well, 140% is greater than 1 because I have 40% more than 1. Okay, so anything greater than to 100. So anything greater than 100. So anything over 100 is going to be greater than 1. Number 2, it says explain the difference between 1/2 and 1/2 percent. So if I look at 1/2 and start there, 1/2 is equal to 50%. Okay. 1/2%, if we look at it this way, remember I had to take 1/2 and I have to multiply that by 100, which is then equal to 1/2 times 1/100. Sorry, I'm dividing, not multiplying, I'm dividing by 100. And then I flip them the reciprocal. And so I have 1/2 times 1/100th, and I end up with 1/200th. And so they're different values. A half represents 50%. A half percent represents 1/200th. All right, so we're going to write each percent as a fraction and as a decimal. So if I have 150%, that is going to be, if I write it as a fraction, it's 150 over 100. And then if I simplify that, that's going to be divided by 50. So it's going to be equal to 3/2. And then if I write it as a decimal, remember, my decimal means I'm going to take this value. And I'm going to, here, if I have the percent, I'm going to do 150%. And I'm going to divide that by 100. And when I divide, the decimal moves 2 places to the left. So my answer ends up being 1 5/10. So my two values that I have is I have 3/2 and I have 1 5/10. 2/10 of a percent. So if I take 2/10 of a percent, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 2/10 and I'm going to divide that by 100. So this one, it's going to be easier to go ahead and write it as a decimal. So I divide it by 100, which means my decimal is going to move 2 places to the left. So I need to have a 0 in front of there. So my decimal is going to be 0.000 2. And then if I write that, that's going to be 2 over 1,000 as a fraction, but then I simplify. So it's going to be 1 over 500th. So there's my decimal, there's my fraction. 325%. So if I look at 325%, that's going to be 325 over 100, which I can then simplify that down by dividing by 25. And when I divide by 25, I get 4. 325 divided by 25 is going to be 13. So I have 13/4. And go ahead and just leave it in improper form. Don't write it as a mixed number. So it's 13/4. And then my decimal, again, decimal's here. If I'm taking percent and I'm turning it into a decimal, if you recall, I'm dividing by 100. So decimal is going to go here. I move it 1, 2 to the left. So it's going to be 3.2.5%. And then my 3/10. So this is the one where I'm going to do 3/10 divided by 100. Remember, when we divide, it's keep, change, flip. So it's going to be 3/10. I keep this the same. I change the symbol and I flip to the reciprocal. So it's going to be 1/100th. And then I multiply across and I end up with 3 thousandths. And so there's my answer is 3 thousandths. And if I write 3 thousandths as a decimal, it's going to be 0.003. So for your independent practice, you are going to go ahead and do 7 through 10. And then on your math practice and problem solving, you're going to do 11 through 17. So you're going to do all on your practice today.